Until February 2022, the war in Ukraine could be dismissed by some as a quarrel in a faraway country between people of whom we know nothing, especially if they had been influenced by aggressive Russian propaganda and the techniques of hybrid information warfare. But in 2022, the war became full scale, and the propagandistic subterfuge was far less effective. The West had believed that mutually beneficial commercial activity created a guarantee against a full-scale war in Europe. That would see hundreds of thousands of dead and wounded, that a Russian elite with financial property and commercial interests in Europe would not risk it all for an imperial adventure or fall in behind the desperate acts of a genocidal autocrat. But once again, we entirely failed to predict or understand Russia's actions. The trauma and misfortune Russia has wrought on its peaceful democratic neighbour is reminiscent of World War II. But will the leaders that unleashed this barbarism go the same way as the Nazi elite in 1945? Welcome to Silicon Curtain. All our content is also available on popular podcast platforms like Spotify and Apple Podcasts. Please like and subscribe to help new people find our fantastic speakers. And of course, if you enjoy the content, consider supporting us by becoming a patron. Anastasia Edel is a Russian-born American writer and social historian. She is the author of Russia, Putin's Playground, a concise guide to Russian history, politics, and culture. Her writings appeared in the New York Review of Books, the New York Times, the Los Angeles Times, Project Syndicate, Quartz, and World Literature Today. She teaches history at the Osher Lifelong Learning Institute at the University of California, Berkeley. Anastasia, welcome to the channel.
It's a pleasure to be here.
Well, what really grabbed my attention was an article you produced in Foreign Policy, and we're going to cover a lot of the themes that were contained in that, and we will, of course, provide a link to that article in the description of this video. But let's start with one of those main ideas that you put forward in the article, and that's to ask, why didn't mutually beneficial commercial activity guarantee the global security order?
Well, it's an interesting question. I think that we may have collectively confused globalization with adherence to a common civilization, right? So we thought that if we're all watching Friends and shopping at IKEA, we share common values and the same respect for rule of law, for sovereignty, for individual freedom. And it's easy to get confused because any foreign city you come into now looks, the same as far as retail and coffee culture goes. So, but this war has shattered this illusion. Beneath the facade of commonality, we're fundamentally different. There are autocratic states and there are democratic states. And, the nature of autocracy is that it's the rule of one. And that contradicts the very word mutual benefit, right? I mean, in Russia, this is exacerbated by the fact that its president and ruling clique come from an institution that historically in Russia is above the law. KGB, that's heir to NKVD and heir to Lenin's Extraordinary Commission. In its name, it basically puts it above the law, and the only law is the will of the autocrat. And such was Putin's will. He wanted to bring Ukraine back into imperial fold. And so we have been under a certain illusion, I feel, with this whole end of history and how the world is trending towards continuous progress, but it's not. And that is, like any war, it's a wake-up call. The problem with this war, that it's a huge wake-up call that is reordering everything that we have come to take for granted.
And of course, Putin was able to create quite a convincing hybrid informational regime, wasn't he? Insofar as it wasn't just a number of policymakers that were taken in by it. Many oppositionists, I would imagine many Russian citizens themselves imagine they lived in a weak democracy or a sort of hybrid system rather than what now is apparent. Behind the scenes, it's a full autocracy with puppet institutions, Potemkin facade, as you say, of shared values. And this might be going too far, but even some of those liberal institutions like Echo Moskwy and others are now perhaps seen part of that whole machine that created, that fictional facade of a quasi-democratic society.
Yeah, well, I mean, you can't be partially pregnant, right? Like you are either an autocratic regime or you're not. And for a while, I felt that people were. I mean, it's such a complex issue, right? Why did Russia descend into an another iteration of, as one of the people in my article calls it totalitarianism 2.0. They have seen freedom. They felt the absence of fear. It's a very powerful feeling when you were afraid and you're no longer afraid. So the question is, why did it happen? And like any sort of, it was a process. So what started for a lot of Russians, I believe, and I was among them, was this feeling of I'm tired of politics, right? And this is a misnomer because there were no politics in the USSR, but it was a highly ideological, politicized society where you had to be political, and suddenly you were not. So a lot of people just took it as a carte blanche to never think about that again. And I was among those people. I wasn't interested in anything remotely close to ideology. And it was for our generation who studied, Marx and Lenin compulsory, mandatory in school, that was liberating. But then somehow this sort of desire to break out of the confines of ideology, which was legitimate, I believe, during the 1990s when there was no ideology, when when Yeltsin and his government did not force ideology on the society. But that changed with Putin's arrival. He is highly ideological, like most of the people with his background. And you could, I feel like a lot of people were first in denial about what he's doing, and then they were kind of distancing themselves from it and concentrating on something else, on making money, on going abroad, and kind of like, don't bother me with that. I do know and think that a lot of people were uncomfortable with what he was doing even early on, but they just, first, nobody thought that he would be there forever, right? That he would be there past his terms. And the slippage of freedom, it doesn't happen overnight. It's just like a balloon that's pierced and the air gets out until there is nothing left. And I think the big question is, when is the point of no return, when you can't mend it? And
Boiling the frog, I've heard it.
Oh yeah,
the boiling the frog analogy, yeah.
By the time you get there, it's kind of too late to act.
So there's a substantial proportion of the population that didn't flee. We know that anything up to 1 million people have actually fled, and many of them are some of the most sort of talented and educated, which has taken a huge chunk out of the workforce, especially IT. But for those who remain, we suspect that there's a percentage, whether it be sort of 15 to 20%, who are rather actively in favor of the war. But there's a big percentage of people who are perhaps still doing what you described there, which is the sort of ostrich effect of trying to pretend none of this is happening and hoping it will all go away.
Look, I mean, Russia, the most important city in Russia is Moscow, right? And the regime does its best to make sure that people in Moscow don't notice the war, right? And how do Russians measure stability? The stores are still full, the bars are still open, the restaurants are still open. There is no, I haven't been there, but from what I hear from the people who are there, you can't really tell that this is a country that's in a major war, no matter that it calls it special operation and whatnot. So there are so you can live your life as if nothing happens, right? But also this deep deep inside, they might not show it in opinion polls, but they know what's, particularly people with access to internet know what's going on, and this creates this cognitive dissonance where you have to make a decision. Either you're out or you're in, right? Because if you're out, you leave. If you're in for some reasons, then you have to make some sort of balance or peace with it, right? And that's just some of it is defense mechanism, right? Rather, otherwise you will go mad, right? Because every day you are complicit in crimes that are committed in your name. I mean, this is a Russian war. This is not just Putin war. So people have to make choices. Not everybody can leave again, and they make choices either to ignore or at least to pretend to ignore, or actively support it, because there is, in any cult, there is sort of some kind of quasi satisfaction from belonging to something bigger than you are. And the propaganda machine, particularly the Russian propaganda machine, is really good at stoking those feelings that you belong to a great place that has been wronged in some way, and they keep perpetuating that narrative in many ways. And so some people make a choice to belong, and this, we're observing this. I'm not sure if you have seen it, this new song that I guess they're trying to sort of make a symbol of the invasion, this kind of "I'm Russian," right? And it goes on and on about how I'm Russian, I'm proud of being Russian. And to me, to somebody who grew up in the Soviet times of internationalism, and all nations are equal, and yes, of course, it was all, it was propaganda too, but it was a different propaganda. You were not supposed to be proud just because you were of a certain ethnicity, and that's not what Putin's ideology is doing. It's basically telling people it's good to be Russian, it's great to be Russian, it's okay to behave well, it's okay to behave badly as long as it is done for the benefit of the motherland. And for some people, that's something that they enjoy. I mean, jingoism does have some kind of extra benefit. But I want to, before we kind of move off this to the next question, I want to make sure that there are also Russians who stand against it. It's just that, I mean, every day in Telegram channels, there's an example of somebody defying the regime, and but those people are, they are single people, right? They can't not even turn around this regime. They can't influence it in any way. They're going to be sucked into the repressive machine, and their livelihoods will be destroyed. But there are brave people and decent people still left. I mean, it's a huge country, right? And there are plenty of decent people left. The problem that we are collectively having is that these decent people cannot change the course that this country is going.
And they're not necessarily part of a network, or they don't necessarily have a consistent sort of philosophy or ideology to sort of group them together. They're almost dissociated acts of protest. And we know there's been a lot of sabotage as well. We're not clear whether it's Ukrainian partisans or those with Ukrainian ancestry, or there's got to be some individual Russians there, no doubt, as well, burning down the conscription offices, the Voenkomat. But again, it's not part of a consistent movement, which means that the isolated acts of protest can only reduce the efficiency of the Russian war machine. They won't necessarily do anything to topple the regime or build resistance to the regime.
Well, look, I mean, all Russian opposition has been destroyed. It allowed itself to be destroyed. But in order to have organized resistance, you have to have some kind of organizing means. You have to have network. And I felt like, Navalny came really close to putting together that network of activism, but it's no longer there. It's so people basically do what Russians are, do well, the acts of individual heroism, and it's almost like martyrdom, right, at this point for people who do this. I mean, I can't get out of my head this story of the girl who drew a painting in her class drawing competition and was ratted out by the teacher to the FSB and is now literally imprisoned in some kind of institution for orphans, whereas her father is arrested. I mean, that is, so when people, I feel like Russia is good at creating this unsolvable dilemmas, right? That they can't be solved. On the one hand, everybody's like, why can't Russian rebel? Why can't they just sweep this regime off that sends them to death, that spreads death in their name? And you feel mad, right, that they can't. But then you listen to a story, you see a story like this, and you understand why. I mean, in a certain way, how much fear that society has. And, it's not justifying the fact that Russian society, basically, well, Russian nation has failed as a society. There is no society in Russia, right? There is a mass of people. They're atomized by their own state because it's easy to keep them in control in that way. But there really is not much as far as sort of common ground between those people, right? Other than fear of authorities.
And I think that's where perhaps the West, hasn't done enough thinking in the 90s. And that's to assume that decades and decades of essentially psychological operations within the USSR to break up civil society, to break up any kind of impulse to self-organize or to define, whether it be through sort of, cultural groupings or nationalities, to define identities outside of the officially designated ones. That process, destroyed, as you say, the sense of class, the sense of any kind of grouping or organization, or the sort of the infrastructure that would do that. And I think we kind of assumed that that would reemerge and bounce back in the 90s. And that hasn't really happened. And to an extent, that made it quite easy for Putin to reassert this sort of machinery and psychology and mindset of the USSR. And we're rapidly, I guess, heading back to that kind of mental space of repression, if not maybe a worse one.
I think you're totally right. We all made the same mistake. You and I, right? We were the people who believed that perestroika and what followed was the natural state of Russia, right? That's something that, it's almost like I felt like we've reached the national catharsis, right? This is where we redeem ourselves. This is where we renounce, the path of that detour that took us into communism and Bolshevism, and we were kind of wandering there in the darkness, and finally we have emerged into light. And I thought that, because my life has tremendously improved, my mother's life has tremendously improved, just because I think for some people feel acutely injustices and absence of freedom, and my family happened to be one of those people. So even though we remained poor in the beginning of perestroika, we still felt that life has improved because there is no this oppressive state that just hangs over you and tells you how to think. So we made an assumption that everybody loved it, right? But then we have to also remember that the dissolution of USSR also caused, or not the idea that USSR will kind of fall apart caused protest demonstrations against that too. So there was a huge contingency of people who did not want this to fall apart. And perhaps in our fever and enthusiasm, we just disregarded them. And we disregarded how unequipped the Soviet state has made them for modernity, right? And obviously the older you are, the worse it is for you, because you don't have the skills, you don't have the opportunities that people who were younger had, like me, for instance. I was lucky enough to work in a Western firm, to hear about an organization called British Council, and to apply for a scholarship and to go out, and that has changed my life for the better. But for many people, it was also a huge time of economic hardship. And so they again, the sort of the fate of the Putin's regime is that it conflated those two things, that he made an equality, he inserted an equality sign between liberal democracy, which was the sort of the stated designation of Yeltsin's government, and economic hardship. And it's also, he stoked the trauma in them instead of allowing the nation to move on past those years. Not only did he reap the benefits of all those reforms that we have suffered through, and it was done by the reformers, by Yeltsin's government. And so he took that when there's some version of capitalism was built in record, in what, 2 5-year terms, 2 пятилетки, right? And then, but then he just basically took the benefit, the economic benefit of it, and then said that and basically convinced the people that the liberal democracy has nothing to do with successes economically, right? That he kind of divorced those two terms, and from that point on started kind of stoking the trauma of the past.
And of course, this coincided with the rise in oil prices and a huge increase in the demand for gas, which sort of fueled the European economy. And to an extent, he was able to provide a material lift. But if we compare that to China and the vast growth in sort of industrial infrastructure and civic infrastructure, I think in hindsight, we can now see that actually the increase in material living and standards, none of that went into political infrastructure. None of that went into building a sustainable society or indeed a sustainable political system. And that makes it sort of doubly tragic, I think, the waste of human and material resource that we're now seeing after those sort of 2 decades.
Yeah, well, the funny thing about Russia is that the certainly material state of Russia has improved under Putin, right? And it's many people have said that Russians under Putin lived at the economical level that they've never lived in their history. And but let's not forget that with all this greatness and mega improvements, you still have a country where 20% of people don't have access to plumbing, right? Like, it's not a luxury, but so all these improvements, they were sort of in enclaves, right? In certain, obviously, Moscow, Petersburg, biggest towns, and it was distributed unevenly. And so, but it definitely is, Russia today, as far as economics go, is not the USSR of my childhood, and which I feel like it makes it so dangerous, because at least USSR was inefficient economically, and it didn't know what it was doing, and it kind of plodded along. But this regime is much more sustainable because it has harnessed the sort of the market economy to its own means, and like you said, benefited tremendously from the increase in prices in oil and gas, and kind of like there was a spillover effect, and Russians now have bike lanes and restaurants that are maybe the envy of Europe, but it's all it seems like it's all a facade, because all these advancements, it's like with Peter the Great, right? I mean, he took all these German innovations and modernized Russia from the point of view of technology. He had completely no interest in exploring parliamentary rule or any other political innovations. And so we now are seeing the example that, sooner or later, this inability to adapt a more humane form of government catches up with you, and will lead to the ultimate destruction of the assets you managed to build, just because unconstrained power, that is Russia, right? It's a power that is above any constraints, basically makes the entire country, which is what, 1/9 of the land space, sort of dependent on the personality and the will of one person. And so when we had Yeltsin and Gorbachev, that worked really well. But when we had somebody, like Putin, we've seen where it can take you, and it's just sad that Russia seems to be defaulting to the same place over and over, despite its sort of own violent attempts at dissolving its own statehood and building something new. And we have seen it, in 1917 with the dissolution of the Tsarist regime, and building the regime that, in many ways, it was much worse just by the scale of it, by the scale of repressions and how many people it could turn into prisoners and execute. And it's just, and then, that thing collapses, and we have some 10-12 years of relative freedom, and but then it's like, the Terminator drops that start gathering into the same thing. And if you're a thinking person, you keep asking yourself, so what is the true Russia? For me, for instance, a person who, for better or worse, identifies as a Russian American, Russian is a part of me. So what am I representing exactly? And there was a hope that we all shared in the 90s, that the true Russia can reunite itself with the West and kind of continue as a member of a shared civilization. But that illusion, that belief, probably we should have paid more attention to what the regime was doing in Chechnya, to what the regime was doing in Georgia, and internally what it was doing. And so, but for some reason, we were not. I can't say we were not paying attention. People were paying attention, but they just didn't realize where this unconstrained model of power of an autocrat takes you, and that's where it took Russia and the world with it. Because again, Russia is a huge place, and if something really bad is happening in a big place, you're bound, to get involved in it, particularly if you're in Europe.
And I think there's two things we really sort of failed to pay attention to there. And it was interesting, a couple of years ago, I heard Khodorkovsky speak in London, and he was asked the straight question, how should we deal with Putin? And this was just after Crimea, but obviously before the full-scale invasion. And he said simply, you should not deal with him. You should have no diplomatic relations. You should have no economic relations. You should not let his elite come in and buy property and park their yachts and their cars. And you should actually put a barrier up and put certain conditions on that barrier coming down. The audience was visibly shocked. I mean, he basically said, Putin's a warlord. He's a mafia boss. That's the milieu that he emerged from. And he's a brutal hybrid between a sort of KGB and Tambovskaya, Grupperovka. But no one wanted to hear that. The audience sort of gasped in horror, like, how can you sort of say that? So he was still seen as a statesman. And I think part of that comes with our Western arrogance, as in the sort of Fukuyama idea that the end of history, liberal democracy will be triumphant, and we're entering a period of sort of calm where all the swords will be turned into plowshares and we can reap the benefit of it. All these ideas are sort of a form of wishful thinking, and we've forgotten perhaps the history of autocrats like Stalin, where you have someone who can guide a country with no limits and no checks and balances. You get terrible decisions being made for sometimes sort of fantastical or whimsical reasons, and they come at a huge price in terms of material and men and suffering. And there's nothing to stop that happening. And I think we'd lost sight of that history.
It is true. I agree with you. I also think that perhaps I'm an idealist, but a lot of misunderstanding of what Russia is was based on our collective desire to see a better Russia, because we, as people who have been touched by, it's hard to say now by the Russian culture, because what is Russian culture? But let's, if we confine it to the 19th century writing and, Chekhov, Turgenev, and to a certain extent by the Soviet literary and cultural tradition, it was an illusion, right? But we grew up believing that there is a better Russia, and this Russia is revealed in those enduring works of art. And when we had, when the USSR collapsed, what was it? Why wouldn't we believe that, now we're gonna see the Russia of Bulgakov and Chekhov, and this free spirit will be released, and imagine what if this country will achieve now without its heavy shackles, as Pushkin would put it. And instead this country goes on and builds another prison, right? I mean, who could have expected that? And yes, we are not policymakers, and perhaps policymakers should have paid a close attention. But to your point about Western arrogance, I think there was also a certain desire to see a world, in the kind of a Beatles Imagine No Religion, and No Borders way. So that's sort of an explainable delusion, but or illusion, right? Delusion, it becomes when you hold on to it. And I think one of the important things right now is to understand that, sort of understanding that you were believing a chimera, an illusion, is a good thing. It's a step forward, because now we know that, whatever we admired in the Russian culture was not the work of, it shouldn't be even called Russian. It was work of individual geniuses. It was also, was Gogol Russian? No, he was made Russian, and he became an imperialist in a sense that he chose to write in Russian. But what other, he had few other choices. So it is, it is all understandable, but we must move on. And I'm speaking as someone who, for me, this comes from a place of great pain, right? Because particularly here, when I moved to the West, I've seen, growing up in a provincial town in Russia, a very, very different country than what I encountered. The perception of Russia was when I moved to Birmingham, UK. I was the only Russian out there back in the 1996. People kind of came to look at me, and there was a much more exalted perception of who I am and what I represent than I saw, because what I saw growing up in a small town in Russia, in a sort of single mother family, was a lot of violence and a lot of oppression, and not a lot of culture, right? There always has been a perception in the West that, you know, Russians are just sitting on a subway car and reading War and Peace, and that's not what I saw, right? I mean, there was a desire to project it. And so I think now it is important to sort of stop being mesmerized by the propaganda that the Russian state for centuries puts out. You know, it always wears a mask, which is, in its essence, after the emergence of the Russian modern state from the Mongol conquest, it has tried many masks. It tried to be, you know, a third Rome. It tried to be 1,000-year-old Orthodox empire, Christian empire. It tried to be a socialist state, and then, you know, a liberal democracy. But it's like doling out these masks, and the West, you know, kind of falls for it every time. I mean, think about socialism, right? And yet I know that a lot of Western intellectuals, and British in particular, were sort of sympathetic to Marxism and the ideas of the revolution, and continue to be so. But how can you sympathize with a place that turned the country into a giant gulag, right? And killed millions of its own people? And so that should have put an end, right, on that. But and yet, you know, we reemerge after Stalin with you know, with a lot of you know, then there is Solzhenitsyn, you know, and everybody is like, oh, that's true Russia, right? And so it keeps appropriating this there's people who, through personal suffering, create these works of beauty. But it's not a healthy pattern, even for culture, right? Yes, suffering makes you write or paint better, but it doesn't have to. There are other ways to get to greatness other than through sort of tormenting the person, so that it starts, you know, seeing other spheres.
And there are interesting contrasts, aren't there, that often go underlooked. So Tolstoy, you know, a great anti-imperialist, many incredibly harsh statements in his literature, really sort of condemning the system and the country that he was brought up in, and making anti-imperial statements. Whereas Solzhenitsyn turns out to be a sort of arch nationalist underneath it, and when he returns, he becomes a key influence on Putin and his ideology. And I think this idea that you described there of masks, when we tear the mask off, you know, Scooby-Doo fashion, what do we see underneath it? It is a primary atavistic, I would call it, lust for expansion, for land, for increasing, you know, territory. And yet, as you say, in the West, we did not interpret the USSR as an imperial project. And I think with the war against Ukraine, there's been quite a lot of rethinking, because Putin's ambitions are so much more sort of naked and apparently, you know, clearly imperialistic. I think it's starting to cause a shift in reinterpreting Russian history itself and Soviet history.
And I think it's about time, right? It's really about time. But I feel that you know, the previous iteration of Russia, in which I grew up, the USSR, it had certain ideas that were antithetical to capitalism, right? And it was built on ideas of equality for all, and justice, and sort of no borders. So there was a lot, to like on the idea level. That those ideas turned out to be unimplementable and perverted on the Russian ground. Whether we would have seen a different result if socialism was adopted in a place that isn't Russia and sort of taken to, and we've seen it with some of the Western countries, right? In Scandinavia, it would have been a different outcome. But in Russia, this really failed economically and socially, but there was a lot of appeal to the West that kept trying to look for something in Russia that, it was almost like an alternative existential universe. Who wants to now, but that thing died when the US, with the collapse of the USSR. Putin's regime was and is not able, despite all of its attempts, right, to create a new sort of magnet for the West, or for the world, at least for the democratic West. So that breath that carried, I feel like, if you think of culture as some sort of soul or breath in a nation, right, and the 19th century definitely, through this its unprecedented sort of flourishing of literature and art and theater in Russia, kind of also extended, it breathed life into a pretty rigid body of the Russian autocracy, and that was sort of that was destroyed during the Red Terror, the revolution, and the class war. But some of it continued, and then the Soviet culture, based on all these, ideas of equality and justice for all, and that created a certain sort of, it carried through, right, a little bit less, but it still formed people, like people of my generation, like me, like my husband, who believed in this sort of alternative Russia, right? But now that breath is it's gone. You can't run on it for centuries. I feel like it. We've seen the last of it back in late USSR, and there is no compelling image of Russia that Putin now can put forward, which will cause the people to look closer into its history, into its to revise its literature and everything that it had said, that it had projected, because I felt like we were under a spell, right, for a long, long time, and this war breaks the spell. It removes the magic that existed, and I felt it through the books, for instance, but also we should never forget that I feel like we, in a sense, those who fall under Russian spell, by definition, are divorced from Russian reality, right? Because the reality of Russia was, curse words kind of scrolled on the desk in my privileged, specialized English learning school. Like, why would you destroy so, pointlessly things around you? And that was the Russian reality, because people were unhappy, they were angry, and they were treated with violence, and violence they dealt back. And it's they were not sitting there watching Tarkovsky.
Watching Tarkovsky, that's the example I was going to use. I remember when I went to my first Russian lesson, and I was a huge fan of Tarkovsky, and the teacher very politely explained that 0.001% of people would have seen the films, and of course they were illegal generally when they were they had a very limited circulation when they were brought out, and yet that cultural soft power has a big impact in the West. As you say, it exaggerates and it hides a lot of the reality that you see behind the scenes. But what's happening now is interesting. And before we hit the record button, a very interesting idea, I think, we were talking about, and that was empire and the deforming effects of empire, but also the fact that the Russian Empire is largely a parasitic entity. And we see that in the 19th century, where it was able to feed off many of the nationalities and countries that the Russian Empire absorbed, off their brain power, in a sort of parasitic effect. And then, of course, during the USSR, it had Central and Eastern Europe also included within its boundaries. And to an extent, it also sort of fed off the sort of collective brains and creativity and resources of that, as well as, its global ambitions. It had a lot of connections with the global South, Africa, and so on. It had huge tentacles around the world, which helped to feed that organism. What we see now, however, is a Russia that has taken its soft cultural power and it's burnt it up. It's taken its moral position in the world, which actually it could have used after the 90s, because it got a bit of a free pass after Gorbachev when the USSR collapsed, but it's taken all of that reputation, all of that goodwill, and burnt that up as well now. And what we also see is that territories bordering Russia are no longer willing to be dominated by it. We have Ukraine fighting back. We have Belarus in a really fragile state. We have Central Asia starting to push back against Russian influence and the parasitism of the system. Where does that lead? Where does that lead the Russian Empire, which historically, I think you were saying before we started talking, has been historically one of the poorest and least efficient imperial machines in history?
Well, when I was writing this article, when the one that kind of brought us to this conversation, perhaps for foreign policy, I interviewed multiple people whose professional sort of occupation in one way or another is to think about Russia. And, I spoke to the top experts in the field, and they were from various walks, opposition leaders, press, politicians, military experts. And in all but one conversation, this idea of disintegration of Russia came up. And, some people like, General Hodges or more American experts like Alexander Vindman believe that the disintegration of Russia as a federal state is inevitable. But the question is, what is Russia itself going to disintegrate from, right? I mean, it's still going to be a huge place. Whether it will fall into, there is a map that's kind of running around internet with different post-dissolution lands like Ingria and, the Cossack Republic and whatnot. Whether it is, whether it will happen, I feel like is anybody's guess. But the interesting part is that everybody I talk to, say for one person, believe that it will happen in one way or another. And I wonder whether it's our collective desire to see this thing fall apart. And because we've seen it, that it's a menace, right? I mean, it just keeps reassembling its progressively worse iterations. And partly this is driven by the fact that a land that big as Russia, with weak atomized society, like it's interesting that here in America, for instance, there is this concept of community war, community activism, like community. I can't bring myself to find an analogous word in Russian, right? So there is no such thing. So there is no community, and to rule a realm like that, you need to have, what Putin calls vertical of power, or it's your old centralized, militarized model that was introduced by the Mongols to the conquered lands of Rus, which it keeps sort of reproducing in many ways. And we just how sustainable it is. It's not sustainable without, I feel like Russia is not sustainable as a single state without repression, because the moment Gorbachev pulled repression back, the whole thing fell apart. And so whether Russia will fall apart, it depends on the commitment of the people who will be in power in Russia, whether it's Putin or whoever comes after him, to keep the realm together through violence. And the biggest ruse that I feel like they staged is they convinced a huge chunk of Russian population that their personal survival is tied to the survival of the Russian state in its borders as defined by the current autocrat, right? And so because of that, they might be able to convince people to keep fighting in this war. I don't think that all of the people who are in Ukraine, the Russian military, are went there because they are bloodthirsty and they want to kill Ukrainians. I mean, there must be those two, but I'm thinking about the majority who from their childhood were raised with this idea of one day, motherland will call you, and you should give your life for the motherland. And so it's been like that during my times in the Soviet way, in a milder way, right? Because at least in the Soviet times, we were brought up with this idea, perhaps erroneous, that Russia never attacks first. Like, we only defend ourselves, and because we had this great war right behind us, where USSR was attacked by Nazi Germany, that kind of rang true, right? And so there was that you have to be always ready to defend the motherland. And obviously Putin took the victory in the war, which he kind of ascribes to the Russian people alone, although everybody who was part of the USSR contributed, right? And then he makes it a foundational moment and part of the new Putin's Russia identity, where this war trauma is constantly stoked. It's just, imagine going to a therapist and to unload your childhood trauma, and instead the therapist says that's who you are. The war, burning villages, and also Russians are raised in this. So a lot of people are just basically, they feel, oh, okay, it's my turn now. I'm gonna go into that train or whatever it takes them to Ukraine, and I'm gonna die there. And that is, that's a very sad outcome for a place that could have been something else. And yeah,
and that's something similar to what Peter Pomerantsev said when I spoke to him some time back. I talked about Russians being good at fighting, and he said, no, Russians are not good at fighting. They're good at suffering and dying. And there does seem to be an impulse there, as you say. There's toxic narratives. There's history that's been mythologized. There's a strong imperial history that either pushes out any other alternative history, pushes out any other narrative, and has then been imposed on everyone's heads. We have to remember that a big chunk of Russia are not ethnic Russians, and yet this same imperial narrative has been sort of baked into the heads of tens of millions of people. It's difficult to know how that can be unbaked, but there are potentially other narratives in Russian history. If we're going to walk back from the current situation and a fragmented Russia, there are some stories in Russian history of revolt, of independence. There's the Novgorodian Republic. There are moments in Russian history prior to Muscovy and this endless imperial expansion. So potentially the idea of Russia might not be dead, but it would need to transform significantly, and it might have to become a series of local identities and mythologies rather than a huge transnational one.
that would be an ideal scenario. The question is, who's going to do it? Russia itself is not going to do it. It's not in the interest of the current regime, because now, I mean, look, if the international court is issuing an arrest warrant for the president, what's going to happen to all the underlings, right? I mean, that sends a very, very powerful message. So to imagine that people would sort of wake up from their slumbers and sweep the autocratic reign away, I don't think this is a realistic scenario. It's just it has come too far with the repressive machine, with the brainwashing, and with general passivity of the population and destruction of opposition, really, because you have to have some kind of organization in order to make regime change. So if we look at Germany, and how Germany was reformed, the Allied powers helped sort of rebuild Germany along the non-Nazi narrative. But there was no nuclear weapons back then, and who's going to be doing the same thing to Russia? And that's my big question, because Russians themselves, I'm not sure they are capable to overcome not that, everybody is capable. Russians in the West, most of them behave like normal people. And, it's not to say, I don't believe that, in genetics of being an autocratic nation, but I do believe in historical precedent. And if we look at Russian history, yes, you brought up the Novgorod Republic, but I'm not sure even if it's Novgorod and Muscovy were the same place. Yes, they were made when the bell was torn down, and people from Veliki Novgorod resettled to other places. But the thing is, I'm just not sure that there are any mechanisms that can be activated in Russia right now to sort of make it a better place. And I know that some people whom I interviewed believe that Russia can be reformed, and let's all hope that it can, because what's the alternative, right? Like, what's the alternative? You have this giant country that basically essentially descended into fascism, and so you've got to do something about it. You can't let it sort of sit, because there are a lot of people who say, yeah, let's surround country with a ditch filled with crocodiles, right? That's a fine concept, but it's got to be a pretty deep and long ditch, and we don't have that many crocodiles, right? So we have to figure out a way, just for our own security. Like you started this conversation, this is not about Russia and Ukraine. This is not even about Russia in Europe. We're witnessing a geopolitical realignment, and the visit of Xi to Russia underscores that Russia is not that isolated as we want to think. So you can't really isolate a place like it. It will always find some kind of allies, and there may be something like Iran, but hey, if you get a bunch of them, you have a coalition. So what do we do with this? And I think we need to, as the West, to also look at ourselves a little bit, right? And think, okay, why is it compelling to some people, or some nations, to keep aligning themselves with Russia, and how do we change that? Because that's what I feel is going to be happening in the next decade, right? This realignment is very, very real. Whether how and when will and whether Russia will fall apart, I feel like nobody can tell you, right? There is a consensus, but part of it that it will. But I wonder if part of it is just a projected desire for a better reformed Russia. The question would be, what do we do with all the people out there who have been poisoned by the imperial mindset, by stoking their trauma, and honestly, by decades of really destroying everything that moves, that thinks. We can talk maybe not even decades, but but centuries. And as far as if you're wondering whether this, you mentioned that there is some history of rebellions in Russia. In the modern Russian state, I feel like there are, other than the peasant revolts, which were not political in essence, there is not much, because the Romanov autocracy collapsed when Nicholas abdicated, right? The change in Russia, regime change in Russia, at least in Russia in sort of the terms that we're talking about, modern terms, has always come from the top. Gorbachev decided to reform USSR, and that's why we had. So to think that that the Russian population will sort of rise up, I think we're past that point. I think we have all hoped when Navalny returned, and they imprisoned him, and before that poisoned him, that would be enough for people, and it wasn't, right? And then we thought that the start of the war, and it wasn't. And then we thought that mobilization, and no, nobody rises up for reasons we can talk about for 2 more hours, but that's the reality. So I feel like we need to think about how do we handle a big state that's in a descent into fascism, and I feel like we're only in the beginning of the spiral.
And it's not just fascism. I mean, it's a descent into lawlessness as well. So not only do you have, internal lack of due process and lawlessness, I mean, how can you trust any treaty or arrangement made with such a state that does not adhere to those sort of concepts of international law or treaties? To an extent, you've got a law of power, law of the jungle, let's say, and it's states like China, perhaps, in Iran, North Korea, know how to deal with it because they understand that power dynamic, and they're willing to exercise it. But difficult to see how a democratic state can interact.
It is true, and it's no surprise that Putin likes to quote from Kipling and the Jungle Book. It's like he keeps pulling up those metaphors as though other books have not been ever written. And how do you deal with a rogue state that just goes around and does what it wants? And I feel like a lot and we talked about this before, when Stalin was doing what he was doing and killing people by millions. He was kind of it was viewed from outside of Russia as kind of a domestic affair, forgetting that USSR wasn't exactly a voluntary arrangement, but for some reason, there was a lot of credit given to Russia's sort of attempt to build forced attempt to build socialism. But now that illusion is gone, and there are no more credits, I feel like, to give to Russia. Russia has run out of the world's goodwill as far as the Western democracies go. It doesn't mean that it will not continue being Russia. It will seek to build alliances with other outcasts of the Western world and tell them, you're not an outcast, come here, we'll band together and we'll be strong and mighty. And I think that that's a huge diplomatic challenge, which we would have to solve. And I hope there are that people out there, and the Hoover Institute and other establishments like that are preparing for this new reality, because the past is gone. There is no more Russia of Gorbachev, even of Brezhnev. It's a very new entity that we're dealing with that has kind of reneged on its own norms. I mean, Russia has never been particularly a place governed by laws, but now what's happening with recruitment of convicts and sort of people who were outside, but by their own laws, they were put in prison and basically given guns and said, go and do what you want and be violent. And that's really scary, right? Because those people are gonna come back hailed as hero, like we witnessing the creation of this new elite, which I think is another word that's completely inapplicable to the Russian context. There is no elite. There are people with the guns, right? Or the people who have power over other people. And so that is sort of like a dark, if you continue that trajectory, what is it going to do to the society that's already been battered by decades of unconstrained rule? Now it's there are no norms. There's just everything is reset to violence, and moreover, it's kind of becoming institutionalized, right? When you give a Russian hero star or whatever to the person who used to a sledgehammer to heal his own grandmother and then became a fight in Ukraine, you're sending certain messages, and that's also, I feel like the Russian state machine is really good at not only creating propaganda, but like replicating it and introducing it into, it has, I guess in marketing terms, you would use the word, a lot of touch points, right? I mean, schools, kindergartens, they all pick up, theaters who all of a sudden fire, a beloved actress just because of her anti-war stance and hang the Z letter on their facades, and lessons in kindergarten how to assemble guns, right? I mean, that is all happening very quickly and at a mass scale, and it's just bound to create a very unpleasant environment, which in the long run, like if you're so unhappy, like if this is such a dark place to be for everyone, but 10 people, what's the point, right? Like it's unsustainable in the long term. But the question, of course, is how far is that long term, and where are we in
That's
the
the
long
one no one can answer, isn't it? And I fear that Russia is both more fragile and more robust than we give it credit. And this thing, monstrous though it is, can carry on going for a very long time. And this is another narrative, and this will be the last sort of question here, but this is another narrative that, the Oscars notwithstanding, I think is going to gain more force over the coming weeks and months, and that is that the Russian opposition, despite their martyrdom and sacrifices, and in many cases like Ilya Yashin and Karamurza, it's incredibly noble, and they're extraordinary people, but the Russian opposition is toothless. They're still acting as if they're living in vegetarianske времена, vegetarian times, whereas the times they're living through are red in tooth and claw, and they do not have the aggression, they do not have the organization, they do not have the ruthlessness to go up against the people who are in charge, and of course the Siloviki class, the entrenched bureaucracy, the FSB, who are some of the most ruthless people to have emerged in history. And that doesn't give me much hope, unfortunately.
Yeah, and if I think in terms of, because we do look at Ukraine, right, and Ukrainians who for the really long number of centuries have been part of the same project, a polity, what not sometimes willingly, but most of the times forced, right? And so these people who are Slavs and kind of like share the same certain ethnic characteristic, and so they go on and they have Maidan and they call their government to answer and they change presidents, right? And so they are ready to die for freedom. And that's what I felt like is a fundamental difference, is that Russians are not ready to die for freedom. They can adapt their existence to live unfree, right? And I feel like that's why Ukraine succeeded in becoming a democracy and Russia hasn't, because nobody is willing to go all the way. And also, I feel that, there is deep inside, there is not enough love that Russians have for their own country. That's why they prefer to either leave or just that's why, if you really loved your place, you wanted to make it a better, like no sacrifice is big enough, but we haven't seen it happening. And that is perhaps the starting point would be to make Russia a better place, a place where people want to fight for it and to fight for their own dignity, right? I mean, because that's what I felt was happening in Ukraine. They didn't want to be told whether or not they can join the EU. They wanted to be masters of their own fate. And the Bolotnaya protests in Russia that, were happening around the same time, on historical spectrum, they didn't go far enough, and that was the end, right? Like, so it didn't produce the revolution that could have turned Russia around, removed the regime, and sort of returned Russia to at least the 1990s, as far as the state model is concerned, that there was no readiness on behalf of the opposition to go all the way. I mean, that's my perception. But there's also, Russia is an empire, right? Even the best people in Russia, because you live in an empire, might be tainted by the way, not tainted, but influenced by the way the empire projects itself. And so, we just, I wish that all political prisoners are freed in Russia and allowed to compete freely and run for president and or parliamentary republic and whatnot. But I think this time around, if it happens, right, we can't just afford stepping back and watching it as a nice sort of a movie with a good ending. We've got to know that the forces that hold Russia together are fundamentally anti-democratic. And so I feel like the first time around with the dissolution of the USSR, the West was too happy by the economic opportunity that this giant consumer market opened, and they thought that the market would solve itself. Well, now we don't have that, guys. We don't have that illusion. So we would need to figure out how to, if there is a regime change, and that regime change is not to somebody like Prigozhin or Kadyrov, or but say somebody like Navalny or Khodorkovsky or whoever comes to power, would those people be able to hold Russia from another slide into its default mode? Because as we agree, its default mode is not pretty, right? It's an empire that just kind of leaves off the land that it seizes, and it mines them and extracts their human and natural resources, and that's how it operates. And that's not a healthy model. It would need to be retrained, and that would be sort of $1 million question of how to do that.
Well, I think we've come full circle with that, and I absolutely agree. The solution would be a decolonization, a fragmentation, a building back up from the ground up on a non-imperial model. But how that happens, I don't think anyone has that answer. I'm not sure that many in the opposition have even embraced that idea yet. Khodorkovsky is starting to, but many have not. So I think, we leave this interview with a lot of questions unanswered, but hopefully at least we understand the problems much better from the conversation we've had. And it's been absolutely fascinating, Anastasia. I'm incredibly grateful that you spent so much time so early in the morning in your time zone to talk about these heavy issues.
Yeah. But no, I greatly enjoyed our conversation. It's always good to talk about these things rather than stew on them, right? And because that's what we're all thinking about, and it's always good to bounce ideas off. And I'm grateful that you reached out and we had this talk.
Well, thanks so much, and hopefully we'll get the chance to do that again.